people back at the first Levellers Day in real life for a couple of years, and it's good to see the day re-established here in Burford. My name's John REES. I'm one of the people that's been helping out with the organisation, and I'm an author of a book on the Levellers and the English Revolution of the 17th century. I'll be chairing the event today. I'm going to make a few opening remarks, partly to replace Ted Balance, who's been called away on family business, and then I'm going to introduce Professor Anne Hughes to speak to you. But I thought first it would be worth just making a few remarks to kind of frame the way in which we might think about the Levellers and contemporary politics. And of course the theme of Levellers Day this year is about the defence of the right to protest and about the right of free speech in the face of the legislation that's already been passed by this government, and more to come from the Queen's speech. There's a phrase we prefer not to be using, and I guess an appropriate moment to welcome any Liverpool fans that are here. Special place at Levellers Day. But that legislation proposed by the government now worsening what was already appalling attacks on the right to demonstrate and the right to free speech. But I guess in the service of historical accuracy, and also importantly to give you the sensation that not everything gets universally worse all the time, I guess we could start with something that happened to John Lillburn, the best known of the Leveller leaders, who was arrested in the late 1630s for importing illegal radical religious books from the Netherlands into this country. The state had a monopoly of what could be printed, and anybody that was bringing in unlicensed books was committing an illegal act. Lillburn was given away by one of his compatriots. He was arrested and taken before the Court of Star Chamber. Now, the Court of Star Chamber was a prerogative court, so-called. It sat at the pleasure of the monarch. It was a no-jury court. The most frequent means of obtaining a conviction in the Court of Star Chamber was to get a confession from the defendant under cross-examination. Lillburn refused to recognise the court. He said that no free-born Englishman should be judged in this way, and from that moment on he was known to the London crowd as free-born John Lillburn, or honest John Lillburn. For his defiance of the Court of Star Chamber, he was thrown into the Fleet Prison, which is where Fleet Street now is in London, and his punishment, he didn't know it was coming until the morning that it happened. He was dragged out of the Fleet Prison, tied to the back of a cart, or as he put it, tied to the arse end of a cart, dragged through the streets of London down to Whitehall, and every step of the way he was beaten with a three-thonged knotted leather whip, so that as one contemporary observer in the crowd said, his shoulders swelled to the size of penny loaves. When he got to Whitehall, he was put in the pillory. He was still throwing the illegal pamphlets. It makes you wonder whether the forces of law and order were any more efficient in the 17th century than the Met are today. He was still throwing the illegal pamphlets from his coat pocket and making speeches to the crowd until his jailer had him gagged, whereupon he continued to stamp his foot in protest for the remaining 2 hours that he was held in the pillory. So I guess one lesson we could learn is that although the state might be just as keen on shutting people up in the 21st century as it was in the 17th, it doesn't have quite those punishments at its disposal. The Levellers were a above all else, perhaps, the first organised political movement. They eventually, long after these days that I've described right at the beginning of the English Revolution, Lillburn stayed in jail until the Long Parliament met in 1640. The first MP to make a speech advocating that he be freed was a then little-known Huntingdon MP called Oliver Cromwell. He was indeed freed to participate in the huge demonstrations which eventually ended up driving Charles I from the capital, and he remained until his exile after the execution of the king in 1649 at the heart of the most radical of those who were engaged in the English Revolution. They were, as I say, above all, an organised group of activists, organised around print. So the way that Lillburn was known to the London crowd was that his travails were put into a pamphlet issued by a compatriot of his, a man called William Larner, who remained a mainstay, a secret printer, an underground press owner, a mainstay of the Leveller movement throughout its history. He linked up with other activists and printers like the fantastic pamphleteer Richard Overton, and eventually their organisation had a publication devoted to it, a weekly publication called The Moderate. I mean, I know somebody's going to make the joke, don't worry. You won't be the first. If you look at The Moderate in the archives, there's at least one reader who's amended it. He's written, this is a contemporary reader in the 17th century, he's put a little arrow between the word the and moderate and put the letters UN, so that it reads the unmoderate, and then put another little arrow at the end of the moderate word which says rogue, so that it reads the immoderate, the unmoderate rogue, which probably would have been an alternative title back when they didn't use it. So they were above all people organised in print, and that took organisation to do it underground, to have it distributed, to have it posted, to have it sent to soldiers in the New Model Army, to have it sent to radical congregations in churches and distributed on Sundays. That took organisation. The demonstrations, some of the material printed by them says, you know, meet in Covent Garden, then a kind of new development in London, to march to Westminster. So these are people who are organised for radical political purposes, and perhaps the first, and certainly one of the most effective first movements in British history. They produce a programme, the first attempt at a written constitution called the Agreement of the People, which advocates religious tolerance, certainly within some limits, freedom of speech, freedom of press, annual parliaments, and an extension of the franchise years and years before parliamentary reform became a reality. They had important support amongst the New Model Army. They were effective debaters with the leading powers of the day, as they called them, the grandees of the New Model Army, and they were contenders for shaping the way in which politics emerged. Ultimately, an unsuccessful attempt to reshape a more democratic politics than was on offer from the parliamentary leaders of the English Revolution. So that's a thumbnail sketch, I guess, of some of the things that the Levellers are known for. I'm going to leave it to Anne Hughes to tell you more. You'll be in extremely good hands. Anne Hughes is a Emeritus Professor from KEELE University. She's written extensively about the Levellers, but she's also written extensively about an enormous range of absolutely critical questions about the English Revolution. The go-to book about women and the English Revolution is Anne Hughes' book on this subject. Her book about the locality, county of Warwickshire, is an important local study of the thing. Her book on the heresy hunter Thomas Edwards is a mainstay of historical reference. So if anybody's able to tell you about the English Revolution and the Levellers, it's definitely
Well, thank you very much, John, and you've left me a bit to say, but obviously John's work on Lillburn is fantastic. I mean, as someone who's earned their living as a historian, I wanted first of all to say how important I think these sort of events are. The great banner at the back, which the North Oxfordshire Socialists, the back of that banner, I think says, "The past we inherit, the future we build." And history is under attack in the universities, where people think you should only, study immediately practical subjects. It seems to me, at the moment, history is an immensely practical subject. We're fed a great deal of cosy, complacent history as part of what are called culture wars. And I think it's very, very important that we do commemorate and recognise a more radical and critical history and alternative possibilities to a history that focuses on the Second World War and how wonderful Britain is. History obviously doesn't teach us direct lessons. We can learn, it gives us resources to think with, it can inspire, and we can learn from it, but obviously not in a straightforward, the Levellers did this, and so we should do the other. At the commemoration this morning, the Minister pointed out that not everyone, for instance, would share the religious inspiration of the Levellers, which was crucial in a 17th century context. And of course, John said I've written about women. The Levellers were potentially the first democratic organised party, but they confined formal political rights to men. The great phrase that is on the poorest he that is in England has a life to live as the greatest he, was uttered, very famous phrase uttered at the Putney debates by Thomas Rainsborough, and he did mean he didn't mean people. He meant that they believed that formal political rights should be confined to men, but they enormously opened up the sort of men who should be able to participate politically. Although, as the choir said this morning, women were very active in the Labour Party. I'll have the women's officer for my Labour Party, and it's not always easy, but women had an important. It was not easy either being John Lillburn's wife, as the burdens of political activism for someone like Lillburn, who was always in trouble, always in prison, nearly always in prison, and struggling for things all the time. But so women were active as distributors of print, and as I shall say in a bit later, politically. So it's, I think, giving us a sense that change is possible, thinking about struggles of the past, not for programmes, but for ideas and things to discuss and talk about. And the first one, I think, which John has mentioned really, but to stress that the Levellers were active in a period of enormous change. And if nothing else, the fact that the world can change, the world can open up in times of turmoil or times of revolution is, I think, important to remember. The Levellers were crucial in sort of London street politics, London religious congregations, from particularly the mid-1640s, but they had their origins in radical congregations and in the people who demonstrated in the very early 1640s to drive the king from London and to make possible, really, Parliament's victory in the Civil War. The Levellers, crucially, were influential in the New Model Army, and although, as we've learned this morning, the New Model Army gets divided by, I suppose, the late 1640s, the early 1650s, this army is also crucial as a sort of citizen army. There's that's one of the great quotes. The other great quote I think I would like to mention is that after the Civil War was won by Parliament, Parliament's army sort of fell out with its parliamentary masters because they didn't think that the things that they'd been fought for were actually being given priority, and that there would be a sort of overly moderate, I suppose, or surrendering peace with the king, who had been defeated over and over again in the Civil War. And in the course of this dispute between the army and its political masters, the army issued a great remonstrance, which was printed, saying we were not a mere mercenary army called forth to serve all the powers of the state, but we were brought forth to defend the people's liberties, by which they meant particularly perhaps religious liberty, but also an expansion of political rights for the people whose sufferings, whose lives and treasure had been spilt in the course of the Civil War. And the existence of these sort of radical elements in the army and in London is what makes possible the great sort of symbolic events of the English Revolution, the trial and execution of the king and the creation of a republic. Now, the events of Burford, which we heard about this morning, are really about the divisions that succeeded this sort of very great symbolic act, well, more than symbolic, obviously, for Charles I, but it's worth, again, thinking at least about some of the slogans and the sort of culture surrounding that, even if it, didn't live up to everyone's expectations. First of all, the king was tried. He's not the first in a public trial. It's not the first, obviously, you know, read your Shakespeare, lots of English monarchs have been, got rid of when they didn't suit aristocratic elites. Charles I is tried for crimes against his people. So there's an assumption there of some sort of popular sovereignty, even if who the people were, was left suitably vague. After the king was tried and then executed in the name for crimes against his people, a republic was declared, and with a great slogan again that the people were under God the source of all just power. Again, a sort of claim of popular sovereignty. Now, the Levellers were not impressed by that, because the people who were actually in charge were a small oligarchy. They were anxious about their political power. They were worried about censoring the press. And so the Levellers, one of the most tactless pamphlets, I think, ever written, is called England's New Chains Discovered. That you'd overthrown the king, but as someone else that I've studied, the digger Gerard Winstanley, argued, you hadn't got rid of kingly power. Authoritarian, arbitrary government was still in action. And as a result of, an obviously tactless pamphlet, England's New Chains, John Lillburn, Richard Overton, William Walwyn, and a man called Thomas Prince, who John must know something about, but he's like the fourth man that no one knows a great deal about. The four Leveller leaders were put in prison. And at this point, the song about the Bonnie Bessies coming to get Lillburn out of prison, I'll come on to say a bit more about, John said something about, but about leveller organisation. A great petitioning campaign, public protest, which we'll be talking about in the current situation later. A whole series of petitioning campaigns were organised, from apprentices, the people of Buckinghamshire, the people of Hertfordshire, and very dramatically by groups of women. And you do see here the Levellers' skilled organisation. People do have the right to petition Parliament, humbly to petition Parliament, in a sort of, perhaps this is what the government wants to, quiet, humble petitioning might still be all right, if this bill is passed. But the Levellers were doing mass petitioning, and they were doing consciously women organising together to petition. And that was very alarming and very distressing to the Parliament. The women were told to go home and wash their dishes and listen to their husbands. And one of them, who might have been a woman who was also a radical religious writer called Catherine Chidley, said, "We have no dishes left to wash. We paid so much taxation, suffered so much." But the women were not claiming what we would recognise as formal political rights. But they were saying that from the example of the Bible and from the example of British history, we think that women have a role to play in the Commonwealth. And also that if the Commonwealth is subject to oppression and suffering, women suffer as well as men. So we have the right to petition, and we want our comrades and leaders out of the Tower of London. They also said, as John said, they said, if you want to sign this petition, go to your ward, your London ward, don't worry, come meet your ward organiser at 11 o'clock and sign it. So it's a very conscious attempt to rally support for getting the Leveller leaders out of prison. It doesn't work precisely, but I'll come to that in a minute. And they do the same actually, as John suggested. Lillburn spent a period in exile, then he comes back 1653, when the Leveller movement really has been rather marginalised. He's put in prison again, and the women get going again, claiming the right to petition and organising. So I did want to say a little bit more about Leveller organisation. Print, as John said, is crucial. The new media, the English Revolution, perhaps with the Dutch Revolt as well, is one of the first massive political upheavals to which print is crucial. And cheap print, broadside, small pamphlets. And it's in a period when people are getting more literate. And it's a bit, well, I'm always saying it's a bit like the internet. Young people are more literate than their parents. Probably their mothers have not been able to read. But younger people, particularly in a city like London, probably can read. Print in the 1640s, including underground printing of people like Lana and Richard Overton. And so they organise and make sure they use print to rally people so they know what the petition is about, and they also write about it afterwards. And Lillburn has been called, and it's not entirely a compliment, the first celebrity radical. And that's a slightly belittling phrase. But it's also about, they very strategically make Lillburn's difficulties, say with the law, emblematic, representative of wider struggles. And we do that today as well, don't we? And it's a very effective way of organising. So they're very up on the modern media of the time. Secondly, they organise where they are. It's a very simple phrase. William Walwyn, one of the Leveller leaders, who is in some ways intellectually more radical than Lillburn, and is very much subject to attack by sort of political rivals. And when he's defending himself against one of his rivals, he says, oh, well, I first met this man who's now smearing me in the affairs of my parish, my ward, and my company, his economic organisation. So they're organising in London religious congregations, in the parish, which is a religious but also a civil organisation, in the London corporational structures, and in there, most of them are not desperately poor, though some are young apprentices and so on, but in their economic environment. And they're organising actively on the streets, particularly by petitioning, and addressing Parliament, which is the authority, and insisting on the right to print what they like, the right to protest, and the right to address Parliament collectively, and perhaps even if you're a member of Parliament, in a rather threatening fashion. And so I think they're organised, you know, say why we wouldn't, you know, the agreement of the people has some fine phrases, but the details probably are not necessarily relevant to us. But the organisational seriousness, I think, and ingenuity probably is. And then I want to talk a little bit towards the end, I think, about law and Levellers, the law and history. As John said, from being a very young man, barely in his 20s, when Lillburn was in trouble for distributing illegal pamphlets in a position where censorship was very strong. I should have said censorship broke down in the 1640s. It is very important. He called himself a freeborn Englishman. So, to some extent, the Levellers had a sense of perhaps a slightly romantic, to use a word they wouldn't have used, view of English history, of Magna Carta, of English traditions as guaranteeing certain legal rights. The right to a jury, the right not to incriminate yourself, the right of free speech. But they also, of course, so there's some sense there of liberties, things that have been won or conceded in previous struggles that need to be defended, and that obviously has some relevance to our current situation. But they also, of course, and the agreement of people and their various programmes had that, wanted reform of the law. What they had was preserving what you'd got from history was not enough. Many of the legal proceedings, for instance, were in Latin or in legal French. And actually, in the 1650s, even with England's new chains, the law is put in English and is made more accessible. Look, the main law courts were confined to London. So the whole level of stress on decentralisation and localism has some reference. But it's this mixture of protecting your liberties and a sense that you had liberties that should be protected, with also a movement for change. Richard Overton probably, or in one pamphlet, said Magna Carta is but a beggarly thing. It's not sufficient for what we've got. But for Lillburn, his life was saved by trial by jury. In October 1649, he was tried for treason against the new Republican state, and he defended himself with a bit of help from a lawyer established from him, you know, created a great stir. There's all this petitioning going on. And much to the horror, and we've had some recent examples of this, much to the horror of, I think there's some seats there, you don't go far, wide you go. Much to the horror of the authorities, a London jury acquitted him even, you know, and he was enabled to go into exile, saved his life, essentially. As a blueprint, I think there's lots there to inspire us, lots there to think about, and lots there that is just really interesting. Stop there and let you...
Right, well, thank you very much, Anne. That was a terrific introduction to the Levellers' ideas and organisation. Now, I'm going to take some questions now from the audience. I'll just, in order just to frame the discussion from the floor, I'll just tell you a Leveller-related story. Henry Martin, who came from this bit of the world, was perhaps the only reliable ally that the Levellers had amongst MPs. He was detested, I think it's fair to say, by the moderates of the day. He had the habit of catnapping on the benches of the House of Commons. One of his opponents caught him doing it and said to the Speaker that he thought that the nodders should be put out of the chamber. In other words, the people that were falling asleep should be chucked out of the Commons. But Martin wasn't quite as asleep as his opponents thought, and he immediately stood up and proposed that the noddies, the bores that had put them to sleep, should be thrown out of the Commons. And with that in mind, I'll take 3 questions.
Can you tell us what happened to the Levellers in the 1650s? They just disappeared?
Well, I guess they get...
Could everybody hear that question?
Yeah, oh sorry, was asked what happened to the Levellers in the 1650s. Yeah, I think things like the mutiny that reaches its, you know, what's the word, you know, disaster, climax end here in Burford. I think that it has to be said, if the sort of radical coalition that had, if you like, pushed forward the trial and execution of the king is very seriously split. And particularly people who, this is to oversimplify, but people who were more focused on religious liberty and religious toleration for Protestants were pretty satisfied with what had happened, were less worried than the Levellers were about arbitrary legal procedures, about reintroduction of press censorship, and about, you know, nothing much changing, what was essentially an oligarchic form of government with no immediate... The Long Parliament, which had been elected in 1640, it's called the Rump, because the people who are left and still committed, you know, broadly to a republican cause, were still there. So there were no prospect for a while of elections. So I think following the imprisonment, the defeat of the mutiny in the army, and the control really of the army, and then the imprisonment of the leaders, the exile of Lillburn, it mostly just goes quiet. And the people survive. William Walwyn settles down and becomes a sort of gentleman doctor. One of them, John Wildman, makes a living property speculation. Lillburn's in exile, Overton's lying low. What's interesting though is at certain times, and Lillburn in the end becomes a Quaker, and there's one argument that people, I don't know if retreat is the right word, because the Quakers are quite a vibrant, radical movement, but move on to different things. But when Lillburn's back and tried again in 1653, what's interesting is in a crisis, and then to some extent the upheavals that presage in the end the Royalist restoration. There's, you know, re-emergence of radical networks. But yeah, 49 is a sort of high point, and also a sort of dispersal, I suppose.
While you're on the question of religion,
Yeah.
as you have both explained, it's so important at that period. And without taking any kudos away from you two authors, A.L. Morton's book, The World of the Ranters,
Yeah.
is an excellent study of
Yeah,
that. But the Quakers seem to have carried on,
yeah.
don't they?
Yeah.
Could you just dwell a little bit on that aspect of it,
Yeah.
please?
I think the Quaker, I mean, there may be Quakers here, so I
Sure.
apologise if I say anything that you, well, if you disagree, by all means. The Quakers are, I think, remarkable because it's on one level a sort of inspired religious movement about, your immediate relationship with Christ. So, in that way, there's a lot of what look to us, speaking as an atheist, very technical religious disputes about who goes to heaven, what sort of ceremonies you can have. The Quakers say it's about your immediate relationship with God, and they're very successful very quickly picking up disillusioned members, Baptists and so on. But they also have this amazing, they're like the Levellers in that they have very meticulous organisation. So, I mean, just two stories about that, and they go all over the world. There's these amazing women who end up being imprisoned on, I think, Cyprus or Malta by the Turks. And there's a great campaign to get them out of prison, and they find them, they're there in prison knitting, and very content, about God's on their side. The Quakers are perhaps even better than the Levellers at using print. And so there's a sort of radical Quaker called James Naylor who comes to a bad end, really, because he's accused of blasphemy, who goes to Chesterfield, which is important to some of you, and they say he's moved by God to go to Chesterfield to have an argument with the Baptists and recruit people. The day before he gets there, somehow, through God's inspiration, all sorts of Quaker pamphlets are already in the marketplace being given out. So the Quakers are this amazing combination of nitty-gritty attention to detail, and we'll get over all these complicated things and say we're inspired by God, and they're much more political. They're in the army. Of course, they're going around heckling people, shouting at the established clergy in the street. So they're not. I once had an argument with Quakers in Lichfield, because I live in a very unpromising place, who said, we think George Fox was mentally ill, because they're obviously much more sober, quiet people nowadays than the George Fox of the 1650s. But the Quakers are very important, and are not, and I mean, I've sort of, it's perhaps been the answer to the last question, it's not a simple giving up of politics at all. It's perhaps a recasting politics in a more clearly religious framework.
They were against the execution of the king, of course.
Well, whether they were Quaker, so were the Levellers really, because of legal process, and he was in there.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to take a couple now in a row, because I can see that what normally happens in these meetings is that it's only halfway through questions that people formulate their ideas. So I'll take a few in a row, and then we'll come back to Anne, and she'll do her best to deal with the hand I've given her. Yeah,
thank you. Interesting you mentioned Henry Martyn, John. Of course, he was famously one of the very, very few Republicans before the Civil War started, and perhaps the only atheist in the House of Commons. And he had an important quote after the King's execution, I think still chimes today, isn't it? Now they've beaten the dog out of the room, where will they lay the stink? And indeed, that's when the radical movement, if ever was one, split. But I suppose the question, if I got one, is did Leveller ideology ever have much of a foothold outside London and the army? because I think there's no question when you look at it from a provincial point of view, and I, like Anne, started out as a county historian of the Civil War period, that radical religion was much, much more entrenched and more significant at the time than radical politics, and of course in the form of the Quakers and the Baptists and other independent congregations was much more enduring afterwards, whereas the level of government's beliefs disappeared for centuries afterwards. But is there any evidence of wider leveller action outside London and the army?
Okay, and here?
So, you talked about John Lillburn, the revolutionary, and John Lillburn, the Quaker, and, you know, I'm happy to be corrected. I'm a trade unionist, not a historian, but wasn't there a period when Lillburn so fell out with Cromwell that he actually welcomed the Restoration? If that's not right, you know, how far did Lillburn go in terms of opposing Cromwell? Because that's like a big problem, isn't it, for people who start on the left and then the times go against them, and then they have to adjust. And I thought there was a period in which Lillburn was welcoming the overthrow of Cromwell in some way or another. And the other thing is about what's always worried me as a trade unionist who tries to read a lot of history is academic history. And, you know, every now and again, and you alluded to it, the battles that go on in universities between like truth and right, and as we understand it, the heroes and heroines that we want to celebrate in pamphlets and days like this, and the battles that go on academically, and we have got no doubt that you too are on the side of the angels in believing totally that there was a revolution. But as I understand it, you know, A.L. Morton, who's been alluded to, and Brailsford, and in particular Christopher Hill, sort of seem to dominate and win the argument that there was an English revolution, and since then there's been a bit of a counter-revolution, and lots of books have been written. There was one book that was called Britain in Revolution, which was like trying to portray the revolution as a bit of a bicycle ride, which is weird. But maybe you could comment on the current state, because for most of us, academic battles are really, you know, you're on our side, I've got no doubt about that, but academic battles are academic battles. Because maybe there's not another country in the world where, like, universities are such a pile of intellectual shit. Like, you know, so, what is the current state? So, have you guys won the argument that there was a revolution, or are there still respected academics who say, nah, there was never a revolution in this country?
Okay, those two questions. I just have to tell you that both of those last two questions, there are libraries devoted to those issues. So I'll give Alan a chat. I'll take one more in the back there.
Obviously, this is the most important period in our history, and it's very relevant today. And we need to think about the relevance of it for today. And I think that one of what's happening here is our own democracy is broken. We're watching this party game. We're watching the corruption of our politics and the collapse of our political system. We're simply watching it go on, but the lesson from this period is that you can reform Parliament if you mobilise people, the country, to take power themselves. So we need a programme of radical parliamentary reform, because really what they did was they reformed Parliament by getting rid of the monarchy in the House. But we actually need an English Parliament. I would go further and say we need a Parliament in England. And I think Tony Benn, of course, and I think the thing about Tony Benn was he put this down in his 1992 bill, and we haven't taken enough notice of what Tony Benn had to say in his bill, which is relevant. And if I was to criticise Jeremy Corbyn, it would be that he didn't take enough notice of Tony Benn. Because Tony Benn did put forward the argument that he needed a parliament in Wales, Scotland and England, but of course we've got one in Scotland and Wales, but we haven't got one in England. So I think that's where we need to go. We need to have a popular movement of parliamentary reform, and that is revolutionary in itself, if we look back to our own history. And that's how we need to go our history.
Okay, well, you could if you add something.
Okay.
Okay.
You start. No.
Okay. Well, I think the thing about I think it's true that level ideas are mostly important in London. and in the provinces, in some garrisons. So I think your point about the army is important. I think whether they disappear for centuries, I think it may be overly pessimistic. There's radical Whigs and other radical people in the 18th century. But yes, I think religious ideas, perhaps more influential in provinces. Lillburn and Cromwell and the academic battles. Lillburn Lillburn and Cromwell is a whole series of things. I mean, as John said, it's Lillburn, and then in the House of Lords, someone who was in my thesis, that Lord Brooke, who was another peer but a radical parliamentarian, get him out of prison in the early 1640s. Lillburn serves in Lord Brooke's regiment, etc. But he certainly, they thought, and people will differ on me, there was what I don't think is a very useful sort of political response. There's a rhetoric of betrayal. Cromwell was seen as someone who was a hypocrite, who betrayed the radical cause. And Lillburn was certainly opposed to Cromwell. He died before the Restoration, so he's not to blame in any way for the Restoration. And John would be probably better at it. There's some notion that that my enemy's enemy is
My friend.
my friend, yeah, is that right? Yeah. So there are some congruences between leveller notions of the illegitimacy of the regime and royalist notions, centring on the rule of law. I think most of the work by John or work by historian Mike Braddock that would not see them as pro-royalist. There's just on things like legal processes, there are some, shared agreements. The academic battles, John and I are likely to think that the tide of revisionism, which underplayed the significance of what happened in the 17th century, I would say we haven't, destroyed the opposition, but I think that there's more acceptance that what happened was revolutionary than there was, say, 20 years ago. I don't think, I wouldn't think universities are shit. Their pensions are increasingly shit. I'm lucky that I'm so old that I've got out in time. But I think, and I would want to say that one would want debate to continue in universities. And I do think there is a that obviously, I write, my own mother used to say, this is very boring, Anne, and I say, yes, but it's very thorough. But I do think there are connections between, there's events like this, there's, A-level syllabuses, there's all sorts of ways in which there obviously are books that are written, and I think I've written some that are for very small, if you like, intellectual communities, but there do seem to be, and this period is an example of where there is an interest beyond the academy. But I think the crucial one now is slavery, and lots of serious academic work on the shit that's been thrown on the woman who's done the work for the National Trust on saying, actually, when we look at these places, we just have to think a little bit about their complicated history. We're not saying you shouldn't have a nice day out and admire, the stuff was looted by, Lord Curzon or whatever. And the trouble that she's had is extraordinary. It really, it's not extraordinary. It suggests how much we're and you know, won't raise difficult issues where John and I think probably disagree, Brexit type things, but you know, then how wedded our culture is at the moment to a very comforting, cosy notion of Britain is all right. You know, we hadn't done any. You know, our empire benefited the world, and you know, we've got our traditions, and you know, we won the war, etc., etc. I do think that intellectual debates, you know, they need to have a connection with, you know, trade union, you know, the broader culture, and I don't think it's there's a sort of spectrum, I think, and I do think these debates are very important, and just to say that history is complicated gets you into trouble, actually, in the current climate. Not necessarily say, oh, everything was radical, you know, or everything was terrible. So I do think it is waffling on a bit. On the reform, yeah, I guess we should have I don't know. I think I wouldn't myself have a very detailed programme, you know, as was suggested at the back. But I do think decentralisation and localism of a sort of participatory kind is what I would take from the Levellers, I think.
Thanks very much. Okay, I'll just make a couple of remarks. So we're coming up on time now, and I want to give you a chance to have a break before we come back for the discussion on contemporary politics and protest in just over half an hour. And I've noticed that the cafeteria is a little bit overrun. I was waiting for coffee earlier and reminded myself of Milton's famous phrase that those who only stand and wait also serve. So I'll give you a chance to go and do that in a minute. Just to respond though, to a couple of the points that were raised. Lillburn's relationship with Cromwell depends on the particular phase of the English Revolution. Remember, you're talking about an event which lasts over a decade between the calling of the Long Parliament and the establishment of the Republic, just over a decade. And they are both very determinedly radicals in the parliamentary cause. But they're a bloc. You know, they have different political interests and a different political base. And sometimes they cooperate, and sometimes they really are not cooperating, and they're arguing very fiercely about what should be the next step. So Lillburn spends a lot of the First Civil War essentially as an agent of Cromwell's in the Eastern Association. And at that time, it's obvious that Cromwell is promoting Lillburn, and it's equally obvious that Lillburn isn't going to say a bad word about Cromwell. At the end of the Civil War, at the time of Putney, when Cromwell is definitely making very substantial overtures to the king, makes a 3-hour speech in the Commons advocating monarchy, the Levellers and Lillburn are in a very antagonistic relationship to them. So that, and there are more ins and outs to that, the construction of that bloc, at the vital moment where it looks as if Charles is going to be able to return to the throne, the Levellers and the sort of forces around Cromwell join together. It's that moment that really forces through the end point of the revolution. I think mainly, I mean, I agree with Anne about there are certain areas, sort of legal, you know, everybody's accessibility to the law and the rights is an important sort of moment of cooperation. But I think the one thing that Lillburn says, which betrays his thinking more clearly than any other, just on the eve of the execution of the king, is that we must keep up one tyrant to balance another until we see which is going to offer us the best. In other words, they want at least more democratic agreement of the people than any other mass active political force in politics. They're already aware that Cromwell probably isn't going to give it to them. They've got every reason to distrust him since the end of the Putney debates and the assassination and the killing of their supporter at Corkbush Field. They don't trust him, even though they've just cooperated with him. They don't trust him, and so they're thinking, if they get away with executing the king, that will give him free rein and we'll be in trouble. And I think it's that kind of tactical political judgment, which is more than any other single thing, informing Lillburn's judgments at that moment. As to the legacy, I think that's certainly London and the army are the two big sources of it. The army, of course, does mean that the ideas travel because the army's travelling and the ideas travel with the army. You know, the people that were in the New Model Army were travelling more than anybody in their family had probably ever done. And they're taking the pamphlets and so forth with them, and we see the traces of those. In my book, I deal with John Reed, who was a religious radical, certainly in the south of Wiltshire, becomes governor of Poole, defends the Levellers, and you could see through those sort of sinews the ideas travelling. But there are some sort of big examples as well of the way that after the defeat of the movement, I think that's true, the movement is defeated and dispersed by the early 1650s, but I think there are some remarkable ways in which it travels. We know, for instance, that the Chartists are writing about and talking about the Levellers. Wilkes is presented with a Lillburn pamphlet as a sort of tribute, an original Lillburn pamphlet. But even nearer to the time, Edward Sexby, who was a key kind of Leveller supporting figure in the New Model Army, he makes his peace with the Republic. What do the Republic do with him? They send him off to France, to Bordeaux, where there's a revolt. He translates the agreement with people into French, and who knows what happened to that. We know that Lillburn's family were related to Thomas Jefferson, that for several generations there was always a male child in Thomas Jefferson's family called with the middle name Lillburn. We know that his estate was called Edge Hill. We know that two more founders of the American Revolution, when they came to visit Britain, went to the battlefield at Worcester and couldn't understand why the locals weren't making more fuss of it. Said, this is holy ground. The Leveller, Richard Rumble, who was actually on the scaffold, I'll end with this, on the scaffold when Charles I was executed, was himself executed for a plot in the 1660s in Edinburgh, I believe. And his last words, and I think this sums up some of the kind of contemporary kind of power of the Levellers as well as anything. His last words on the scaffold were, no man comes into the world with a saddle on his back, and no man booted and spurred to ride him. And he got that from Mercurius Militaris, which was the newspaper aimed at the army, for the Army Scout, by another Leveller, who was also edited by Hills, by another Leveller, John Harris, who was also on the scaffold when Charles I was executed. Those same words, no man comes into the world with a saddle on his back, no man booted to spurred to ride him, are the last words in Thomas Jefferson's diary. So I think you see the way in which, even though the movement is crashed, the ideas behind it, the good old cause, the radical version of the good old cause, sometimes through religious movements, sometimes secular, sometimes domestic, sometimes international, begin to enter into the bloodstream of democratic politics.